my name is Sarah and welcome to another Half-Baked Idea. A few of you wonder why I have the words Feed Charlie written on the board here behind me. Well, this is Charlie. He's my sourdough starter, and that's the subject of today's Half-Baked Idea. For thousands of years, people have been making bread, but they didn't have the kind of yeast that we have now, commercial yeast, which comes in little jars or packages. Instead, they trapped wild yeast, and it was remarkably effective, but in addition to letting the bread rise, it also gave it a wonderful tang that we call today sourdough. Well, sourdough was all of the bread that they had if they used leavened bread at all back in ancient times. So we're going to make our own sourdough starter today. It is important to note that making your sourdough starter starts with a 7-day regimen that has to be followed, otherwise things don't always work out very well with your starter afterwards and you can actually kill it before you can actually get any use out of it. So please follow these steps very closely. For step 1 of day 1, we take a clean plastic container, one that has a lid so you can cover it up at night or when you're not dealing with it. You just want to spoon rye flour into your 1 cup measure. And you pour that into your container. Now you do this twice. You want about 2 cups. And the reason why I'm spooning this is because if you just dip your cup in there, the stuff can get all packed down, and that's not a very good indication of really how much is in there, because you can get up to, say, ½ ounce, 3/4 of an ounce off in your measurements. And so that's a good thing to note for any kind of baking, really, when you're dealing with dry ingredients like flour or sugar. Now, we take ½ cup of pineapple juice, and the reason why we're dealing with pineapple juice is because it's very acidic. And this helps to start breaking down the starches in your flour, and that actually gives the yeast something to work with. So we're going to pour this in. And this will be thick and kind of granular because rye flour is a whole wheat flour. It has the bran, or the outside, the husk of the rye grain still attached when they grind it up. And that's pretty much what you're going to get with any kind of flour that's not, specifically a white flour. You'll end up with the bran in there to some extent or another. Now see how this is coming together and it's kind of like a paste. That's exactly where you want it. You don't want too much liquid in here. Yeah, and you want it to be fairly substantial. I mean, you can see that's very slowly starting to come off on only the outer section, so that's perfect. Now you're just going to mix this up together. Now what we're doing is we're giving the yeast a good bed of starches and sugars, and in addition to the acid that will help to break it down and to create a very nice home for the yeast. Yeast is a microorganism that lives pretty much everywhere, including in your house. Now, I live here in North Carolina where we have a really nice environment for starting sourdough because we have lots of natural yeasts. But the yeast isn't the same as you'd get. It's not the same species of yeast that you would get in, say, the Monterey Bay area. So my sourdough does not taste the same as the classic, for instance, New England sourdough like you'd find in Boston, or the Monterey sourdough that you'd find in California. Instead, everywhere you go, you're going to find sourdough that is unique. And that is one of the special things about this form of yeast production. So, make sure to clean off your spoon. You don't want to waste any of that good yeast trap, or that food for your yeast. We're going to cover this up and leave it alone for 6 hours. And after that 6 hours, we'll add a little bit more food and liquid for our yeast. After 6 hours, still on day 1, we're going to open up our container and add a little bit more rye flour and pineapple juice. Now you don't need a lot, just about ½ cup this time. And, this will just give it a little bit of a boost from the stuff that we gave it earlier. So ½ cup of rye flour and ½ cup of pineapple juice. And again, you're just going to mix this in. One of the things I like to do is once I've gotten it developed a little bit more after a few days, is change it to a truly airtight container before putting it in the refrigerator. And that helps with just keeping a good seal on it so you don't lose any of the moisture from the liquid in here, and so the stuff doesn't dry out. It also makes it very easy to keep your container fairly clean as well, because sourdough starter will turn into concrete when you've gotten it to dry. In fact, I had a friend who left hers in her car during culinary school, and it overflowed into the back seat of her car and turned into concrete all over the carpet of her car. And there we are. We have a thick pudding, almost like a batter consistency to it, and we're just going to scrape off our spoon and cover this up. We want to leave this at room temperature because the warmth is important for allowing the yeast to activate. And so we've gotten a nice liquid, a nice slightly acidic environment, plenty of sugars and starches for the yeast to work with, and we're going to leave it at room temperature overnight. And then tomorrow, day 2, we will start with the next step. Now, on the morning of day 2, we're just going to open up our container, and you see it looks pretty much the same, except it's kind of gotten a little more glossy, and it's very, very thick still. Now we're going to add a heaped half cup of bread flour, or you can continue using rye flour, but eventually you will need to use bread flour because of the gluten content. One of the reasons why you have a starter to begin with is not just for the yeast, but it also jump starts gluten development in your bread doughs. Now we're going to take half a cup of distilled water. It's important that it be distilled water and not from the tap, because in most areas you have a certain amount of fluoride and chlorine in your tap water, and chlorine can kill yeast, especially natural yeast, because it is very, very weak when you first get it started. So we have our half a cup of bread flour and our half a cup of distilled water, and we're just going to mix this in. And again, see how thick it is. Even after I added a little bit of water, it's still really thick coming down off the spoon. But we just mix this up, and this is the kind of thing you're going to be doing pretty much every day for the rest of this week. It sounds really complicated, but this is actually really easy, and total, it takes maybe 5 minutes out of your day this first time, and once you get it started, you can have amazing homemade bread. And we just make sure you scrape your spoon up because you don't want to waste any of this. There we are. And we're just going to close this up, and this evening we're going to do the same again. On the evening of day 2, we need to add the same again. So that's about a half a cup of bread flour and a half a cup of distilled water. And again, you just stir it in. You know, after this has gotten developed, you know, adding a little bit more rye flour in on occasion doesn't hurt. In fact, you know, you could even alternate your rye flour and your bread flour, and it'll do just fine. It would just give it a slightly nuttier, more earthy flavor. And we cover back up, and again, we leave this at room temperature overnight. Now, because we're done with day 2, I put this label on here, reading day 2, part 2 check, and we'll check in with it tomorrow morning. Sometime on day 3, we start discarding from our starter. Now the reason why you do this is because yeast, like any other organism, does die. And when it dies, it's not useful to you. So by getting a little bit of the starter out, you can use this, but this also clears some of the dead yeast, which allows you to, you know, kind of keep it active. Now this is very important in the early stages. Now this can already technically be used, but it would not give you very good bread if you just use that alone, so it would be necessary to spike it. So you take out a 1/4 cup of the starter, you put a heaped 1/4 cup of bread flour and a 1/4 cup of distilled water in here, and again, you just stir this up. And this is all that needs to be done on today, which is again is day 3. And basically from now on we are going to discard some every day. But you can already use this to start making bread, but you will need to spike it, which is the technical term for a sourdough that has commercial yeast in it as well. And again, we're going to remove the old label saying that we completed day 2 and have the new label that says we've completed day 3. On day 4, you should have some definite gases being developed. That's what all these bubbles are for. And you should notice that the level of the starter is rising inside the container. This is good. At this stage, you can actually start refrigerating it if you want to, which is actually a very good idea considering the fact that sometimes the starter will actually rise to fill a smallish container such as this one. So I'm going to refrigerate this one tonight. And you want to take just about half a cup of starter out of the container. And again, this is discarding, which is getting rid of some of the dead yeast in the mix, and just kind of giving everything a little bit of a new lease on life. This is what you do every time you do a discard, and you add a little bit. So add about 3/4 of a cup of bread flour, and again the half a cup of distilled water, and you just mix this in. It's important with every time you add this stuff to just try to get as many of the lumps out as you can. So you just press it against the wall of the container, and that will take out most of the lumps. Again, you just scrape down the spoon. You don't want to waste any of this that you possibly can avoid. And just like with yesterday, you can see all the gases that you've still got on the surface here with the bubbles. So this can actually be used to make bread with. So if you like, you can go ahead and start with this, but be aware of the fact that most sourdoughs aren't really good and stable enough to work by themselves for about a month. 3 weeks to a month. So this would definitely need to be spiked with commercial yeast if you were going to be making bread out of this. But like I said, you can always go ahead and start using this because it doesn't make sense to waste any of this wonderful flavor that you get, even when it's spiked, to make your own sourdough bread. So again, we close up our container, remove the tag for day 3, and replace it with day 4. Tomorrow will be day 5. On day 5, we do exactly what we did on day 4. And as you can see, we've got quite a bit of bubbles active here, which is good. Our yeast is definitely active. And I just pulled this out of the refrigerator and let it set for a couple hours before using this step. So deflate the bubbles and see how stringy it's getting. That's good. That means we also, in addition to fermentation, we also have a little bit of gluten development, just a little bit, which is good. That actually helps with bread baking much later in the process. So we want about half a cup of the starter out. And again, this is just to get rid of some of the dead yeast. You know, clearly you're not going to be getting rid of all the dead yeast, but you'll be getting rid of some of it, and that will keep your starter fresh and active. Again, we have half a cup, a little bit more than half a cup of bread flour and a half a cup of water, and we just stir this in. And as we have completed day 5, we put our day 5 label on it and put it back into the refrigerator until tomorrow. Now, on day 6, we do exactly as we've been doing before. And see, again, we have very nice bubbles here. So we just fill our half cup with starter and either keep that to make a levain out of for some homemade bread, or go ahead and discard it. Take half a cup of bread flour or rye flour and a half a cup of water and just mix it in. And again, we cover it up, change our labels to day 6. Now, on day 7, and this is the last day of this section, we discard, again, half a cup of the starter. And again, we add about half a cup of rye flour and a half a cup of distilled water. Now, after the first full week of mixing and discarding every day, you move to the next 2 weeks. You're going to be doing it every 3 days. And you know, if you happen to be in your refrigerator and you see it, pull it out and give it a stir. And that will just, you know, reincorporate any yeast you happen to have in your kitchen into it, and it will give it a nice blending effect with the yeast that's already there, and just make sure that it keeps active even though it's kind of asleep in your refrigerator. After that, you go to feeding it once a week is enough. And after that, you know, your starter becomes fairly resilient, and it'll be okay if you forget to feed it occasionally, but make sure that you feed it after that first month, about maybe at least once or twice a month, but every week is ideal. We get to put on our day 7 sticker. You can also flavor your sourdough starter with certain acidic components, really everything from molasses to pickle brine. It all depends on what your particular favorite is. What I tend to do is I add about a tablespoon of orange or lemon juice about once every other month or so. That keeps your sourdough happy, and it also gives a nice acidic flavor to my particular bread. In my next video, I will be demonstrating what you can do with your sourdough starter, starting from an immature starter such as this that we've been discarding in this first 7 days, all the way up to a mature starter of several months, up to a year. So thank you very much for joining me, and this has been another Half-Baked Idea.